The party line telephone rang 3 short bursts at 4:17 on the afternoon of May 20th, 1957, and Jim Hutchison knew before he picked up the receiver that somebody had spotted a tornado. He was standing in the doorway of his barn in Creek County, Oklahoma, watching the sky turn colors that didn't belong in nature. Green and black and yellow all swirled together like bruised fruit. His wheat was 10 days from harvest, 240 acres of winter wheat that represented 8 months of work and most of his operating capital for the year. His 37 head of Hereford cattle were scattered across the south pasture, grazing peacefully with no idea that the weather was about to try to kill them. And his wife Eleanor was in the farmhouse 400 yards away, getting supper ready for their 3 children, who would be home from the school bus in less than an hour. Jim lifted the receiver and heard Carl Peterson's voice crackling over the wire, calling from his farm 6 miles west. Carl had seen a funnel cloud touch down near Bristow, moving northeast at what looked like 40 or 50 miles per hour. That put it maybe 20 minutes from Jim's property, maybe less if it accelerated the way tornadoes sometimes did when they found flat country with nothing to slow them down. Carl was getting his family into their storm cellar and suggested Jim do the same. Then the line went dead as other farmers picked up to listen. The party line system that connected rural Oklahoma, lighting up with urgent conversations and warnings, passed from farm to farm. Jim had built his storm cellar 3 years earlier, in the summer of 1954, after the Udall tornado killed 80 people in Kansas and reminded everyone in Tornado Alley that the high school basement wasn't much help when you lived 12 miles from town. The cellar sat 30 yards behind the house, a concrete and timber structure sunk 8 feet into red Oklahoma clay. He had excavated it himself, using a team of horses and a slip scraper, the same way his father had dug stock ponds back in the 1930s. The walls were poured concrete, reinforced with steel rebar. The roof was railroad ties covered with sheet metal and 2 feet of packed earth. It could hold his family plus livestock if necessary, though Jim had never actually tested that theory because in 3 years they hadn't needed it for anything worse than hailstorms and high winds. Now he needed it, and he needed it fast, but first he had to make decisions that no farmer wants to make. The cattle were half a mile out in the pasture, too far to bring in before the storm arrived. The wheat couldn't be saved no matter what he did, but his International Harvester tractor was sitting in the open next to the barn, and that tractor represented $4,000 he didn't have to replace. The barn itself held tools, spare parts, seed for next year's planting, everything that kept the farm operational. The house held his family, and the cellar could protect them, but only if he got them there in time. Jim made his choice the way every farmer in Oklahoma would have made it. Family first, property second, and everything else could go to hell if necessary. He ran to the house, taking the porch steps 2 at a time, and found Eleanor already gathering the children. She had heard the phone ring, had seen the sky, and she knew what was coming as well as Jim did. Their oldest boy, Michael, was 12 and old enough to help. The twins, Sarah and David, were 7 and scared, but trying not to show it. Eleanor had already filled a canvas bag with water, crackers, and a kerosene lantern. She had done this drill before, practiced it every spring because that's what you did when you lived in tornado country. They ran for the cellar across the backyard, Jim carrying David, Michael helping Sarah, Eleanor bringing up the rear with the supply bag. The wind was building now, coming from the southwest, with a steadiness that meant the main storm was close. The sky had gone dark as evening even though sunset was 3 hours away, and the air had that thick, pressed-down quality that made breathing feel like work. Jim pulled open the cellar door, a heavy timber frame with metal hinges that weighed close to 80 pounds, and got his family down the concrete steps into the darkness below. The cellar smelled like damp earth and concrete, familiar scents that Jim associated with safety, even though he had never actually tested that safety against a real tornado. The space was 12 feet square, with a ceiling just tall enough for Jim to stand upright. Wooden benches lined 2 walls, built from oak planks salvaged from an old barn. Shelves held canned goods, emergency supplies, a battery-powered radio that Jim turned on now to hear the weather reports. The announcer's voice was tense, reporting that a large tornado had been spotted on the ground near Sapulpa, moving northeast at 45 miles per hour, with reports of severe damage to farms and rural properties. Jim climbed back up the stairs to close the door, and that's when he saw the tornado. It was still 3 miles out, maybe less. A black funnel that seemed to connect earth to sky with the casual permanence of a support pillar. The funnel was rotating visibly, even from this distance, and debris was already circling its base like a skirt made from trees and buildings, and everything else it had consumed in its path. Jim had never seen anything like it, and he had lived in Oklahoma his entire 41 years. This wasn't a rope tornado or a brief touchdown. This was a monster, and it was headed straight for his farm. He started to pull the door shut, then stopped. The cattle were still out in the south pasture, and while cattle were replaceable, 37 head of good Hereford breeding stock represented years of careful selection and thousands of dollars in value. More than that, they were his responsibility, living things that depended on him for protection. The tractor was sitting exposed next to the barn, and without that tractor, he couldn't plant next year's crop or harvest the wheat that survived this storm. The barn doors were open, and the wind was going to tear that barn apart if he didn't at least try to secure it. Eleanor's voice came up from below, calling his name with the tone that meant she knew exactly what he was thinking, and she wanted him to stop thinking it and get down in the cellar where he belonged. Jim looked at the tornado, looked at his barn, looked at the open pasture where his cattle were starting to move nervously as they sensed the approaching storm. He made a calculation that every farmer in history has made at some point, weighing responsibility against survival, deciding how much risk is acceptable when everything you've built is about to be destroyed. He told Eleanor he would be down in 5 minutes, knowing it was probably a lie, knowing 5 minutes might be 4 minutes more than he had. Then he ran for the barn, covering the 400 yards in what felt like slow motion, his boots heavy in the Oklahoma clay that had turned slick from the rain that was starting to fall. The wind was strong enough now that he had to lean into it, strong enough that small debris was already flying past him, sticks and leaves and pieces of things he couldn't identify. The tractor started on the second try, the old International Harvester coughing to life with a cloud of diesel smoke. Jim drove it into the barn, parking it next to the hay bales and grain bins where it would have at least some protection from flying debris. The barn wasn't going to survive a direct hit, but maybe the tornado would miss. Maybe it would veer north or south. Maybe Jim would get lucky. He had been farming long enough to know that luck was a commodity you couldn't count on, but right now, it was all he had. The barn doors were solid oak, 8 feet tall and heavy enough that it took real effort to swing them closed. Jim got the first one secured, throwing the iron bar across the brackets, then started on the second door. That's when the wind hit with enough force to tear the door out of his hands and slam it back against the barn wall. The impact was so violent that the hinges bent and the door hung crooked, impossible to close now. Jim tried anyway, putting his shoulder into it, feeling the wind push back with a strength that didn't seem natural or possible. Something changed in the air, a pressure drop so sudden that Jim's ears popped and he tasted copper. The rain stopped as abruptly as it had started, replaced by an eerie calm that lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then the roar began, exactly like people always described it, like a freight train except louder and meaner, and coming from everywhere at once. Jim abandoned the barn door and ran for the cellar, knowing he had stayed too long, knowing he had gambled and lost, knowing that the next 60 seconds would determine whether his children grew up with a father or with a story about a man who died trying to save a tractor. The wind caught him halfway across the yard, a gust so powerful it knocked him off his feet and sent him sprawling in the mud. He got up, got hit again, went down again. The cellar was 50 feet away, then 40, then 30. He could see the door standing open, could see Eleanor's face in the darkness below, her mouth moving but no sound reaching him over the roar of the tornado. The wind was full of debris now, serious debris, pieces of wood and metal flying past at velocities that would kill him if they connected. Something hit his shoulder, spinning him around, and he felt pain bloom hot and immediate, but he kept moving because stopping meant dying. He made the cellar door with the tornado less than a quarter mile away, close enough that he could feel the suction trying to pull him back toward it. He threw himself down the concrete steps, landed hard at the bottom, and Eleanor slammed the door shut above him. The timber frame settled into place with a solid thunk, and Jim threw the interior bolt just as something massive hit the door from outside. The impact rang through the cellar like a bell, but the door held because Jim had built it with exactly this scenario in mind, had used 6-inch bolts, sunk 8 inches into concrete. The tornado hit the farm at 4:38 in the afternoon, and for 90 seconds, the Hutchison family sat in darkness, 8 feet underground, while their world was systematically destroyed. The sound was beyond description, beyond anything Jim had experienced, including his time in the South Pacific during the war. The cellar shook so hard that dust rained from the concrete ceiling. The radio fell off its shelf and shattered. Sarah and David were crying. Eleanor was praying. Michael was holding his younger siblings with a grip that would leave bruises. Jim sat on the bench and listened to his barn being torn apart, listened to his house being unroofed, listened to everything he had built over 15 years of farming being reduced to scattered wreckage. Then it was over. The roar faded to the east, replaced by silence so complete it seemed unnatural after the violence of the storm. Rain began again, a gentle patter that sounded absurd after what had just happened. Jim waited 2 full minutes, making absolutely sure the tornado was gone before he climbed the steps and pushed up on the door. It opened hard, scraping against debris that had piled against it, but it opened. Grey daylight flooded down into the cellar, and with it came the smell of wet earth and splintered wood. Jim climbed out into a landscape that looked like a war zone. The barn was gone, not damaged but completely erased, reduced to scattered boards and twisted metal spread across 100 yards. The house was missing its entire roof and the north wall, exposing rooms like a dollhouse cut open for display. The tractor he had driven into the barn was lying on its side 200 feet from where he had parked it, the heavy machine thrown like a toy. Fence posts were snapped off at ground level. Trees were stripped of bark and leaves. The wheat field looked like it had been hit with a giant rake. The neat rows turned into chaos. But the cellar had held. The door had held. His family was safe, climbing up out of the darkness behind him, and that was the only thing that mattered. Jim helped Eleanor up, then the children. And they stood together in the ruins of their farm and counted themselves fortunate because they were alive and uninjured and together. The cattle were scattered, but most of them were still standing, visible in the distance, wandering confused through what remained of the south pasture. The farm could be rebuilt. The wheat was lost, but next year's crop could still be planted. The tractor was probably totaled, but tractors could be replaced. Within an hour, neighbors started arriving, people who had weathered the storm in their own cellars and basements and were now driving farm roads to check on friends. They brought tools, tarps, food, diesel fuel, all the things that would be needed in the days ahead. This was how it worked in rural Oklahoma, had worked since the land runs of the 1890s, would work as long as people chose to farm in tornado country. You built your cellar, you helped your neighbors build theirs, and when disaster struck, you showed up with whatever you had to offer. The American Red Cross arrived by evening, documenting damage that totaled over $300,000 across Creek County. The tornado had been rated F4 on the Fujita scale, with wind speeds estimated at 240 miles per hour. It had traveled 17 miles before lifting back into the clouds, destroying 12 farms and damaging 40 others. 3 people had died, all of them caught in the open trying to secure livestock or equipment. Jim Hutchison had come within seconds of being the 4th fatality, and he knew it. And he never again chose property over safety when a tornado warning was issued. The farm took 2 years to fully rebuild. Insurance covered some of it, neighbors helped with labor, and Jim took a winter job at the grain elevator in Sapulpa to make up the difference. The new barn went up in the fall of 1957, built stronger than the old one with better anchoring and storm-resistant design. The house was repaired by spring, the roof replaced with architectural shingles instead of the old asphalt that had peeled away so easily. The wheat crop of 1958 was the best Jim ever grew, as if the land itself was trying to make up for what had been taken. But the most important thing Jim rebuilt was his understanding of what mattered. The storm cellar had saved his family because he had taken the time to build it properly, had used good materials and solid engineering, had created a space that could withstand the worst weather Oklahoma could deliver. The 3 years between construction and use had felt like wasted effort to some people, like Jim was being paranoid or overcautious. But on May 20th, 1957, that cellar proved its value in the most fundamental way possible. It kept 4 people alive when everything around them was being destroyed. The story of that day became part of Creek County history, told and retold at farm auctions and church socials and community meetings. It became a reminder that in tornado country, preparation isn't optional and storm cellars aren't luxuries. Every farm needed one, built properly and maintained regularly, because the question wasn't whether a tornado would come but when. Jim's experience helped convince dozens of other farmers to build or improve their own storm shelters. And when the next big tornado came through in 1960, those shelters saved lives that might otherwise have been lost. Jim Hutchison farmed that same Creek County property until 1983, when he retired and sold the land to his son Michael. The storm cellar is still there, still maintained, still ready for the next time the sky turns green and the wind starts to build. Modern weather radar provides better warning than the party line telephone system that served Jim in 1957, but the basic equation remains the same. Dig deep, build strong, and when the storm comes, get underground and stay there until it passes. The lesson from May 20th, 1957 isn't about the tornado that destroyed Jim Hutchison's farm. It's about the decision made 3 years earlier to spend time and money building a shelter that might never be needed. It's about the choice between saving property and saving family, and the understanding that nothing you own is worth dying for. It's about rural communities that look after each other, showing up with help when disaster strikes. And most of all, it's about the knowledge that has been passed down through generations of American farmers. Respect the weather, prepare for the worst, and build things to last, because your life might depend on it. Thank you for watching this video. If you found this story valuable, please subscribe to our channel, give us a like, and share this with anyone interested in American rural history and the ingenuity of farm communities. This video is inspired by real events and does not aim to represent or offend anyone. Jim Hutchison is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced similar situations during this era, building storm shelters and making life or death decisions during tornado season in rural Oklahoma and across the Great Plains.